Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. It's my pleasure to have back with me today Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com, as well as the author of a library of books. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always my pleasure.
I thought today we would discuss the advances in social control, which frankly I'm finding are becoming incredibly blatant in everything I read and see. But because of the amount of materials, I thought we would break this discussion into two parts. I have up on the screen now the items we arranged to discuss. The first part is about conceptualizing a framework of social control, while the second part is about where we are today in its implementation with some specific examples, at least the ones that we're seeing. In part one, Charles, you take the lead. And in part two, I'll take the lead. Since we're always short of time, why don't we kick it off with this slide, which discusses social trust.
Gordon, I like your outline here of the agenda in which we're going to talk about a number of concepts that will help us understand how social control works at a sort of overview level. So the first point is social trust, which is the trust between the people, the citizenry, and the government. And so if the government fears that its citizens will not back its agenda and its narrative, then of course the government feels a tremendous pressure to start controlling its population, right? And this is of course a fundamental feature of totalitarian governments, is that they feel that it's essential that they control every aspect of their population and what the population believes. And so then that means that the government has to control the narratives through propaganda. And of course, this is the classic characterization of totalitarian governments such as the former Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. But on the other side of the coin, if the people don't feel that the government is acting in their best interest any longer, then they're going to start resisting this social control. And this resistance can take all sorts of manifestations. It can mean supporting a black market that's outside of the government's control. It can mean like protests and all sorts of manifestations. And so that's the kind of push-pull that we're seeing here in advancing social control.
We did a thesis paper at Matt SII 3 years ago, which was entitled Crisis of Trust. And we weren't as slick as you have been in really laying out how this social control works. But we were really expressing in about 100 pages exactly the degree of distrust in government that's building in the United States and, frankly, most of the Western economies, developed nations.
Right. And we can look at the internet as a force that's really complicated government's social controls, because back in the good old days of the print media and the radio, then, like, say, the Nazis, their propaganda machine had a very few simple tools, large gatherings, but if you controlled the print media and the radio, then you controlled the entire media and the entire propaganda machinery. Whereas now, China, for instance, to control its population, it has to have what they call the Great Firewall, right? There's apparently up to 200,000 people who work for the government and do nothing but try to limit the Chinese people's access to outside information via the internet, right? Because that information from the outside can potentially disrupt, those narratives that the government wants people to believe and act on.
What was that number again? 200,000, you said?
Yeah, that's the number that's been guesstimated.
So we're well behind with Facebook hiring 10,000 and Google hiring 10,000 to control what we're allowed to see. I didn't mean to interject, but so we got ways to catch, but we're definitely on the same trajectory.
Yeah, exactly. And who knows? It might be 2 million people in China. So yeah, it's another make work project. But this is a good example of the difference between force and power. And there was an analyst, Edward Luttwak, who drew the distinction between force and power. And so when a government has power, it can influence its people to follow the government's narratives and policies of their own free will. It may be grudging or they may complain about it, but they act on their own. They don't need to be forced. But in other cases, if they refuse, then the government has to use force. But force is extremely expensive. What you really want to do, real power, is convincing people to do it of their own accord. Right. And so that's where we get into the difference between incentives and punishments. Right. And so and I want to talk real quickly, mention Venezuela as a good example of the difference between force and power. The Venezuelan government is attempting to have power by saying, use this currency, our national currency, the bolivar. Right. And but unfortunately, that currency is lost all of its value. So then people have to turn to the black market. They turn to Bitcoin. They have to go to barter. And can the Venezuelan government put enough soldiers and police on the streets to make sure that nobody uses a black market to buy food, or that nobody uses Bitcoin as an alternative to the bolivar? No, it's impossible. That would require hundreds of thousands of secret police and so on, and that's extremely expensive. So the point here is force is extremely expensive and limited in what you can really do, whereas what you want is power to persuade people to do what the government wants with of their own accord. This brings us to cultural institutions, and the point here is that totalitarian governments and any government that wants to control its population, they want to control the cultural institutions. You can't just control the government itself, right? You have to control the media. You have to control the major churches. You have to control the schools. You have to, the colleges, the museums, the entire cultural edifice of the society has to be lockstep. And this is where we're seeing this in China as well. The Chinese government controls everything. You can have a church, you can worship, but it has to be at a government-sanctioned church, for example. So, and this calls up two basic models for social control. One is the government controls everything. That's the Chinese model, right? The church, the media, the universities, everything is ultimately under the control of the Chinese Communist Party and the central state. Where in the U.S., for example, then the government has a sort of sub rosa campaign of controlling what we see and what we believe is true, and that's through Facebook, Google, Twitter, social media. And Gordon, you're going to talk a little bit more about how that works. But those two models, both of which are very effective, and it depends on whether you have a more open society or a more centralized society. So in China, being a highly centralized society, the government just controls all the institutions. But here in the U.S., which is a more open society, then the government uses these private sector corporations to implement its social controls.
And there's all sorts of ways it can do that. Political correctness. And if you can start to get those being pushed through the social media, and then it becomes almost institutionalized, it controls our society. And you're afraid to say something. You're afraid to speak out against something. I would argue that to some degree Trump's popularity during the election was the fact that he wasn't politically correct at all. But people are seeing that they're being sort of imprisoned by it, and are pushing back to some degree. But it's really through the control of your thinking and using these institutions and social institutions to control it. It used to be the church. I'm not trying to be anti-religious, but at one time, he who controlled the church controlled the people.
That's right, and I'm glad you mentioned the whole political correctness phenomenon because it shows how you don't need to force people. You don't need to arrest people. You simply need to blacken their social reputation or accuse them of some evil, and then you can assert power and control that way. Which brings us to persuasion and coercion. And so what we see in China, and Gordon, you're going to talk more about this, the implementation of this, but what we're seeing in China is they've developed this concept of a social score. And so you get benefits if your social score is high. In other words, you get access to travel. You can actually use the airlines, and you get various benefits. So those are incentives, right? And then if your score if you're rated very low, you're an untrustworthy person in the government's eyes. Then it's a form of coercion. In other words, you're penalized. You have disincentives, and so. The ideal, of course, we know from behavioral psychology is, in the classics, of course, is experiments with lab rats and so on, is that both of these are effective ways of control. In other words, incentives work really well, and in terms of the rat pushes a button and then they get 2 pellets of food instead of 1, then they're going to hit that button. But penalties also work well in the sense that if the rat is shocked when he pushes a button, he's going to avoid that button with great care. And so we have to look at what kind of society do we end up with if the government is focusing on incentives and penalties and persuasion and coercion. We end up with a mix of Huxley, Orwell, and Kafka. And of course, these were authors that Huxley foresaw a society in which the control is through persuasion and incentives. And so the end point for him was that we will, quote, love our servitude, unquote. In other words, we'll be going along with what the government wants, but we'll be enjoying ourselves, and we won't really, we'll lose track of the fact that we're being controlled. Then Orwell's vision was more hardcore. His was, the government's watching you at home and in every nook and cranny of society, and there's severe punishments for anybody that doesn't toe the line. And then that leads, if you mix these two together, then you end up with Kafka, whose novels are describe characters who are enmeshed in this bureaucratic structure that they can't figure out. They don't know what the rules are, and there's no way to remedy any kind of injustice. In other words, false accusations lead to false convictions, and there's no way to correct it. It's really not a legal system, right? Or the legal system is so convoluted that the average person is lost in it. And this is my concern here. My last kind of comment on the social control that's being set up in China is, what happens when the machinery makes a mistake? What if you're misidentified as someone that jaywalks, or that someone uses your name on social media and criticizes the government, and then you're pinned with the penalty? Where's the mechanism for redress? And there doesn't seem to be any, because it's an automated system. And so then we really are entering the realm of Kafka.
Anytime you relinquish power to anything, it's only a matter of time before it's abused. And I don't say abused necessarily evilly, which is often the case, but often it's just bureaucratic incompetence. That's what's happening here when we allow ourselves to be, through either persuasion or coercion, through incentives or penalties, to be led or steered. The real danger today, Charles, is how easily we're willing to relinquish that. I think that's primarily the biggest problem we have. We're willing to entrust so much power, whether it's to governments, to corporations or others, because we think we're expedient, we're in a hurry, it's faster to do it, and you can't do that. And I'll talk a little later here about the amount of control that we now have through the Facebooks and the information that they have. But If you go into any of the apps, and everybody has apps, you'll find that when you hit terms of condition, we just hit the yes, download it, it's free. We don't understand the power and the control that we've given information-wise to these apps, who probably are good people, but it gets consolidated and consolidated again, and you don't know where it's going to be used. And so it's a very dangerous road, and we're clearly on that. But the point I'm trying to make is we're responsible for it. And sometimes we just have to say no or understand the danger of it. Any closing comments on this part, Charles?
Just to say that I think you've really what you just explained is the perfect wrap up for this part one, which is that between force and power, as we've explained, the cheapest and easiest way to get control is through power of influencing people to do what the government wants without being forced. So the government can do it on the cheap. And that's what you're describing with Facebook and Google and these social media controls. Once you click on the app, it's you've already enmeshed yourself in a system, and it was so easy. No one needs to force you to do anything.
Right. There's the incentive. And the worst part is because we're in a hurry and it's expedient and we just want a problem we have to be solved and to go away. The difference between power and force, we control it. We as a consumer have more power than the government. But the way we're now relinquishing it so quickly, it won't be long before the government will have more power than we have over us. And we won't even know how it happens. And I'm going to talk about that, what's already going on around the world and in China here in part two, to really try and put some meat onto this diagram we're looking at here, Charles. So we'll be back with part two.